Forgiving John Maguire, I'm going to pull out of that. We're going to take it to Washington, to the State Department, because Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is talking about U.S. relations with Iran. Let's hear from him now.
A lovely wife and a family. I wanted to express my condolences to him. His service to America was noble. As a member of Congress, we worked together on pro-life issues during my time in Congress. I know lots of you have questions about the Middle East and Iraq. I'll certainly take some questions today. But first, too, I want to offer my condolences to the people of Australia for the tragic loss of life and property caused by the devastating wildfires across that region. America's thoughts and prayers are with the victims, their families, and the emergency service personnel putting themselves in harm's way. And the same goes, too, for the dozens of U.S. firefighting personnel who are standing side by side with our Australian friends fighting the flames together. As I said when I was in Sydney just this past summer, we have a truly unbreakable alliance. They are great friends, and we're happy to be able to help the Aussies in this time of need. Staying in Asia, we noted the appointment of Liu Huining as the new head of the Hong Kong Chinese Central Government Liaison Office. He's expressed hopes that Hong Kong will return to the, quote, right path, end of quote. The right path, as I've said before, is for the Chinese Communist Party to honor its commitments made to Hong Kong in the Sino-British Joint Declaration filed at the United Nations, a commitment that guarantees the territory's independent rule of law and freedoms that the Chinese living on the mainland, unfortunately, do not enjoy. The United States will continue to work with Hong Kong and the Chinese Communist Party officials to protect human rights and fundamental freedoms in Hong Kong and to promote Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy. In Afghanistan, there's an aspect of that conflict that deserves more attention, and that is the Islamic Republic of Iran's involvement there. Iran has refused to join the regional and international consensus for peace and is, in fact, today, actively working to undermine the peace process by continuing its long global efforts to support militant groups there. Most people know about Iran's proxy networks in the Arab world, but the regime also has a relationship with the Taliban and related groups, such as the Haqqanis, the Tora Bora, and the Mullah Dadullah group. The Taliban's entanglement in Iran's dirty work will only harm the Afghanistan peace process. A couple items here in the hemisphere. In Venezuela, I want to thank and congratulate Juan Guaido on his re-election as the President of Venezuelan National Assembly, a legitimate re-election by a quorum of 100 deputies. The Maduro regime's campaign of arrests, intimidation, and bribery could not derail Venezuelan democracy, nor could its use of military forces to physically bar the National Assembly from accessing the Parliament building. I applaud how Venezuela's political parties came together to support Guaido's re-election. The United States will continue to support President Guaido and the Venezuelan people, and we will continue to rally all other freedom-loving nations across the globe to do that same thing. We support the Venezuelan people because we believe the Western Hemisphere should be a hemisphere with freedom everywhere. I also want to highlight the work of the OAS, which has been an instrumental tool in moving the region in that direction. It's an example of truly outstanding, effective multilateralism. Secretary General Luis Almagro is the leader we need for the OAS to continue proactively addressing the central challenges facing the region, promoting democracy, upholding human rights, advancing security, and fostering economic development throughout it. I have more to say about the OAS and the multilateral reform in the coming weeks. On the theme of basic freedoms, I want to commend members of Bahrain's Council of Representatives for their January 2nd statement, in which they expressed deep concern over the inhumane and painful conditions to which Uyghur Muslims in China are subjected. Bahrain is recognizing what I've been saying for months. The Chinese Communist Party is committing mass human rights violations and abuses against Uyghurs, ethnic Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and other Muslims held in detention in Xinjiang. We're happy with what Bahrain did, and we ask all countries, particularly those belonging to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the Arab League, to denounce the Chinese Communist Party's brutal treatment of Uyghurs, which is part of the party's broader war on faith. Moving to Europe. As many of you know, Prime Minister Mitsotakis is in town this week. I'm looking forward to welcoming him here. I'll be with him today at the White House alongside President Trump. I also want to announce that our Undersecretary for Political Affairs, David Hale, will be traveling to Brussels later this week, where we'll have conversations with 28 European counterparts. This is a recurring meeting that happens about every 6 months. This particular gathering is important because it immediately precedes an EU foreign ministerial on Iran that has just been scheduled. And it shows, too, once again, our close cooperation with our European partners on issues of mutual concern. I'm sure while David's there, the issue of Iran and Iraq will feature prominently in their conversations, and they'll have an opportunity also to discuss priorities such as Syria, North Korea, and China as well. Finally, one more personnel matter. I want to thank Ambassador John Bass, who I've come to know in my time in service both as the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency and now as Secretary of State. His 2-year tour of service in Kabul was remarkable. That's one of our most important missions. Ambassador Bass is a respected strategic thinker, a man of incredible integrity. He's helped that country move forward to a brighter, more peaceful, and more secure future for all the Afghan people. And I, too, want to welcome our new 11 ambassadors and 2 ambassadors at large who were confirmed since the end of November, including Ambassador Sullivan, who will be heading off to Russia before too long. Glad they're finally getting out to the field, and we hope to have more follow them out there. With that, I'm happy to take a few questions.
Matt.
Thank you. Happy New Year, Mr. Secretary.
Hello, Matt.
And in honor of the new year, I have exactly 2,020 questions to ask you, but I'll pare them down for the sake of brevity.
Thank you, sir.
One is there continue to be questions about the nature of the intelligence that led to the strike that killed General Soleimani. Can you be at all more specific about, how imminent this was, what exactly it was? Secondly, why not allow Foreign Minister Zarif to come to the UN to speak at the Security Council? And then lastly, did the situation in Iran have anything contribute at all to your decision not to run for the Senate from Kansas? Thanks.
Thank you. Last one's easy. I said the same thing yesterday that I said for months. No real news there. I've said that I'm going to stay serving as Secretary of State so long as President Trump shall have me. No. You can accuse me of being inconsistent otherwise, but not on that one. Second, we don't comment on visa matters, those traveling here to the United States on visa, so I can't add much more to this issue of Foreign Minister Zarif's travel to the United States. I'll say only this. We will always comply with our obligations under the UN requirements and the headquarters agreement, and we will do so in this particular instance and more broadly every day. And finally, there's been much made about this question of intelligence and imminence. I answered it multiple times on Sunday. I'm happy to walk through it again. Anytime a president makes a decision of this magnitude, there are multiple pieces of information that come before us. We presented that to him in all its broad detail. We gave him all the best information that came not only from the intelligence community, but for those of us who have teams in the field. We evaluated the relevant risks and the opportunity that we thought might present itself at some point. And we could see clearly that not only had Soleimani done all of the things that we have recounted, right, hundreds of thousands, a massacre in Syria, enormous destruction of countries like Lebanon and Iraq, where they've denied them sovereignty, and the Iranians have really denied people in those two countries what it is they want, right? Sovereignty, independence, and freedom. This is all Soleimani's handiwork. And then we'd watch as he was continuing the terror campaign in the region. We know what happened at the end of last year in December, ultimately leading to the death of an American. So if you're looking for imminence, you needn't look no further than the days that led up to the strike that was taken against Soleimani. And then you, in addition to that, have what we could clearly see were continuing efforts on behalf of this terrorist to build out a network of campaign activities that were going to lead potentially to the death of many more Americans. It was the right decision. We got it right. The Department of Defense did excellent work, and the president had a entirely legal, appropriate, and a basis, as well as a decision that fit perfectly within our strategy and how to counter the threat of malign activity from Iran more broadly.
Kira? Mr. Secretary.
Yes, ma'am.
Two questions, if you don't mind. Iran's Foreign Affairs Minister Zarif granted an interview saying that Soleimani was on a diplomatic visit to Iraq, that the U.S. strike to take him out was state terrorism, that President Trump has prepared to commit war crimes, and that Iranians are enraged. First, that's the first question. I'd like your reaction to that. Second question. President Trump has indicated that Iran's cultural sites could be targeted. Is that true? Are they on the target list? And if so, do you consider that a war crime?
So, let's see. So, Zarif's statement His first statement that is Soleimani was traveling to Baghdad on a diplomatic mission. Anybody here believe that? Is there any history that would indicate that it was remotely possible that this kind gentleman, this diplomat of great order, Qasem Soleimani, had traveled to Baghdad for the idea of conducting a peace mission? I made you reporters laugh this morning. That's fantastic. We know that wasn't true. We not only know the history, we know in that moment that was not true. Zarif is a propagandist of the First Order, and most of what you suggested in his text message or email or message that you laid out there was indeed Iranian propaganda. It's not new. We've heard these same lies before. It's fundamentally false. He was not there on a diplomatic mission trying to resolve a problem. I know there's been some story that he was there representing a Saudi peace deal. I've spoken to my Saudi counterparts at great length. I'll leave to them what the contents of their messages may be, but I can assure you that they will share my view that he was not there representing some kind of agreement that was going to reduce risk or reduce the risk to the lives of Americans when he was on that trip. Your last piece was about cultural sites. I said on Sunday, I will reiterate it again. Every target that's being reviewed, every effort that's being made will always be conducted inside the international laws of war. Seen it. I've worked on this project, and I'm very confident of that.
David Brenton?
Thank you. Mr.
Yes, sir.
Secretary, it's an election year, and you're now facing two nuclear-related crises with Iran and North Korea. Are you optimistic about resolving either of those without them sort of blowing up, so to speak, at inopportune moments? And on the Iran front, Iran's breakout time when you came into office was considered to be about a year. Is it now longer or shorter?
I'll leave it to the intelligence team to talk to you about the details of Iran's breakout time for the moment. But President Trump could not be more clear. On our watch, Iran will not get a nuclear weapon. And as we came into office, Iran was on a pathway that had been provided by the nuclear deal, which clearly gave them the opportunity to have those nuclear weapons. We won't let that happen. As for the first question, which was more broadly, what President Trump laid out in his national security strategy with respect to both North Korea and Iran is the plan that we have executed, the strategy that we have executed for this past 3 years. We have put Iran in a place that it has never been before, where they've had to make some very difficult choices about how to pay for and underwrite their proxy militias around the region, whether and how to build out their missile program. This is a flip from where we were 8 years before. It's not political. Previous administration made a different choice. They chose to underwrite and appease. We have chosen to confront and contain. Those are different strategies. We believe ours is successful, and we ultimately believe it will be successful at making Iran behave like a normal nation. We'll deny them the capacity to build out their nuclear program and threaten not only Americans and our lives to keep Americans safe, which is our mission set, but also to create enhanced stability throughout the Middle East. We're confident that that's the case. North Korea, which you asked about, we still are hopeful that we will be able to head down a path. I was here with you all in December sometime when there was lots of talk about what might happen at the end of the year. We've not seen that yet. We still remain engaged and hopeful that we can have a conversation about how to get the denuclearization that Chairman Kim promised to President Trump back in 2018. Mm-hmm. Take one more.
Okay, James.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Two quick things here on the Soleimani strike. Since the Trump administration withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear deal, about 2 years ago or so, the Trump administration has said repeatedly that it is pursuing against Iran a maximum pressure campaign. First question, the Soleimani operation, was that part of the maximum pressure campaign?
Do you have a second one?
Yeah, we'll come back to it.
If you just ask them both, then I'll tackle them both
To your
together.
knowledge, was any legal counsel in the executive branch consulted for his or her input surrounding the legal aspects of the strike prior to its execution?
I'll leave to others to comment on that, but I can say as a pattern and practice, I have never seen this administration engage in an activity of this nature without a thorough and complete legal review of what the bases would be if the president were to make a series of decisions. Often the lawyers review all of the options that are being presented to the President of the United States in advance of them being presented, such that every option that is presented to him has been fully vetted through the legal process. I'm confident that that was the case here, although I don't have specific knowledge of that. I'm confident that that was the case. Second, you asked about the scope of the strategy and the maximum pressure campaign that we've had in place. It has a diplomatic component, it has had an economic component, and it has had a military component. And what you have seen over the course of these past, May 2018, when we withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, you've seen us execute that with enormous vigor and energy. You've seen it diplomatically. We've built out coalitions around the region with the Israelis, with the Gulf states, on certain files, on the missile file and on the terror file with our European partners as well, not just the E3. Go back and look from May of last year. Go look at the statement that was made in Warsaw, a united statement centering the instability in the Middle East on the Islamic Republic of Iran. We've got a coalition now in the Straits of Hormuz. We've diplomatically isolated the Iranian regime. Second, economically, we've all seen the sanctions put in place. It's now over some 1,000 sanctions. We've watched the regime struggle to figure out how it was they were going to make it through 2020. They've got a budget that will fall short by a significant amount in 2020 as a direct result of the pressure that we've put on the regime. And then you saw over not just this past week, but over the last year, you've seen our security component to this. You've seen us reinforce allies in the region by ensuring that the Emirates and the Saudis and all of the others were prepared for what might happen if Iran decided to make choices that were bad for the Iranian people. And then you saw more tactically, just these last few days, the president's response when the Iranians made a bad decision to kill an American. We hope they won't make another bad decision just like that one.
Clear. The Soleimani strike was part of the administration's maximum pressure campaign, and going forward, the Iranians should understand, as they develop their calculus, that similar actions, such as the Soleimani strike, could well continue to be a feature of this maximum pressure campaign.
I think the president's been unambiguous in his both the remarks he made down in Florida as well as the tweets that he's put out about the seriousness with which we take this, the risk attendant that we are deeply aware of, and the preparations we've made to prevent those risks, as well as our determination that in the event the Iranians make another bad choice, that the president will respond in a way that he did last week, which was decisive, serious, and messaged Iran about the constraints that we are going to place on that regime so that it doesn't continue to put American lives at risk. At the end, our Iran policy is about protecting and defending the homeland and securing American lives. I know that the efforts that we have taken, not only last week with the strike against Soleimani, but the strategy that we've employed has saved American lives. I'm highly confident in that. I'll take one more. Take one more. Yeah. Andrea, yes, ma'am. How are you?
Thank you very much. A question about the issue of cultural sites, because the president said on Air Force One coming back, after you had been on the Sunday talk shows, that they're allowed to kill our people, they're allowed to torture and maim our people, they're allowed to use roadside bombs and blow up our people, and we're not allowed to touch their cultural sites. It doesn't work that way. Defense Secretary Esper has made it clear that he would not follow an order to hit a cultural site would be a war crime. I'm wondering whether you would also push back in your advice or in your role.
You're not really wondering, Andrea. You're not really wondering. I was unambiguous on Sunday. It is completely consistent with what the president has said.
No,
we will take every action we take will be consistent with the international rule of law, and the American people can rest assured that that's the case. Let me tell you who's done damage to the Persian culture. It's not the United States of America. It's the Ayatollah. If you want to look at who has denied religious freedom, if you want to know who has denied, the Persian culture is rich and steeped in history and intellect, and they've denied the capacity for that culture to continue. If you go back and look at the holidays around Cyrus and Nowruz, they've not permitted people to celebrate. They've not allowed people that they've killed, that Qasem Soleimani killed, they've not allowed them to go mourn their family members. The real risk to Persian culture does not come from the United States of America. That there is no mistake about that. Thank you all. Everybody have a good day.
So, Mike Pompeo there. talking about and questioned about the nature of the intelligence which led to the attack and the killing of the top Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, which at the time he said had made the world a much safer place. But when questioned about whether there was a specific imminent threat, appeared to be slightly backtracking on the existence of such. And he was also asked about what President Trump had been saying on Air Force One about targeting 52 cultural sites. And again, really a sort of veil being brought over that issue as to who said what and at what particular time. This all follows what's been going on in Iran in the last few hours, where it's being reported that scores of people have been killed in a stampede in Iran as vast numbers of people turned out to attend the burial of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian commander killed by that US drone strike. The funeral in his hometown has now been postponed. Well, Soleimani was considered the second most powerful man in Iran, and his assassination has raised fears of a conflict between the United States and Iran. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale now looks at the latest.
Today, the long farewell to Qasem Soleimani reached his Iranian hometown of Kerman. Vast numbers once again cramming into the streets to catch a glimpse of the cortege carrying the remains of the military commander killed by the United States last week. Such were the crowds that around 40 people reportedly died in the crush, with many more injured. As a result, officials said they were postponing his burial. The people called for vengeance when the mourning is over, and their foreign minister said Iran's response would be proportionate against what he called legitimate targets.
The United States killed important personalities, both Iraqi officials as well as Iranian officials, in a foreign territory. That's an act of war done in a cowardly terrorist operation, and Iran will take appropriate response to that. De-escalation means the United States not taking further measures to stop threatening Iran, to apologize to Iranian nation. But the action by the United States has consequences.
Iran's parliament passed a bill designating all US forces and President Trump himself as terrorists. It also allocated an extra $220 million to the Revolutionary Guard's Quds force that was led by General Soleimani. In Baghdad, there was some confusion over the future of US forces in Iraq after Washington denied reports based on a leaked letter that it was preparing to pull out troops, something that would have huge consequences for the 400 British military personnel there. In London, ministers gathered in Downing Street to discuss Britain's response, hoping to diffuse tensions as they await Iran's response.
Well, what are you going to do about the Iran situation?
All efforts to de-escalate.
At the same time, their colleague, the Foreign Secretary, travelled to Brussels for talks with European allies to try to find common ground with the US and protect coalition forces in Iraq tackling the Islamic State group, also known as Daesh.
We are concerned that if we see a full-blown war, it would be very damaging, and actually the terrorists, in particular Daesh, would be the only winners. So our message all around, and we're working with our US partners, our EU partners, that's why I'm travelling out to Brussels today, to make sure that we send a very clear and consistent message on the need for de-escalation and to find a diplomatic route through.
In the US overnight, there were vigils for peace amid growing fears that Soleimani's assassination could tip an already volatile region into war. President Trump is hoping his threats of further military action will deter Iran, but the risk of miscalculation is high. James Landale, BBC News.
Just seeing, Iran has started the burial ceremony for General Soleimani. We're just hearing that in the last few minutes. Also hearing that NATO says it's moving some personnel out of Iraq due to safety concerns. As you can see, Gary O'Donoghue is waiting to talk to me from Washington. Just listening to Mike Pompeo there, was there a bit of reining back?
Well, look, I think there's been a lot of ambiguity over the last few days since the killing of Soleimani about the nature of this imminent attack that was used as justification for taking him out. There's been some toing and froing on whether or not there's something specific in mind, whether or not there were specifics in mind, whether they were just trying to stop more of the same that had already happened from escalating further. And I don't think we're any clearer or any nearer to that. What the Secretary of State said today was that Soleimani was building out his network of activities that could have led to the deaths of a lot more Americans. That's pretty vague, quite frankly. But he also said that we know that it wasn't true. We know that it wasn't true, he said, that Soleimani was in Baghdad on a diplomatic mission. So that implies there is something specific. So I think you have to pay your money and take your choice. I think there's a possibility, Simon, that it will become perhaps a little clearer in the next day or two, because the administration is planning to brief congressional leaders in the next 24 hours and wider members of Congress.
Gary, forgive me, I'm going to have to pull away from you purely because we're going to House of Commons, because Ben Wallace, Defence Secretary, make a statement on what's going on in the House.
Happy New Year, Mr. Speaker, and it's good to see you in the chair. With permission, I would like to make a statement on the security situation in the Middle East. Mr. Speaker, I have deep regard for the nation of Iran, and I chaired the all-party group for Iran in this House for 8 years and visited the country on a number of times. Indeed, the last time I visited with the leader of the opposition, and we went together to visit the Iranian government and the people. It's a wonderful place with a dynamic population, and the world owes a great deal to its culture and its history. But in recent times, Iran has felt its intentions are best served through a nefarious use of proxies and the use of subversion as a foreign policy tool. It has provided practical military support to the murderous Assad regime in Syria, stoked conflict in Yemen, armed militia groups in Iraq, and has repeatedly harassed international shipping, including UK shipping, in the Strait of Hormuz. It has also shown a total disregard for human rights, holding dual nationals in prison and causing unimaginable suffering, not just to those in jail, but to their families at home. Such behaviour does nothing to enhance Iran's reputation with its neighbours and has had a seriously destabilising impact in the region. Mr. Speaker, one of the foremost architects of Iran's malign activity was the Quds Force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. And one of its commanders and leading enablers was General Qasem Soleimani, who on the 2nd of January was killed by a US drone strike. Mr. Speaker, General Soleimani was no friend of the UK or our allies in the region. He was not an advocate of a more peaceful and prosperous Middle East. His clandestine operations saw him supply weaponry to proxy forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. He encouraged proxies to develop weapons such as improvised explosive devices that killed and maimed UK soldiers and other Western forces. And nor should we forget how he fomented instability in places like Basra, where British forces were stationed. The United States government has asserted that General Soleimani organised the strike on the 27th of December by the militia group Kataib Hezbollah, which targeted a US military base in Kirkuk, Iraq, and killed a US civilian contractor, and the US is confident that General Soleimani came to Baghdad to coordinate imminent attacks on American diplomats and military personnel. The UK will always defend the right of countries to defend themselves. The House will want to know that since October 2019, coalition bases, which contain both United States and United Kingdom personnel, and the Baghdad International Zone have been attacked 14 times. One attack on K1 base involved 32 rockets. Our challenge now is, however, to deal with the situation we find ourselves in. The US consistently showed restraint through all those previous attacks, even when their right to self-defence was well established. Since the early hours of Friday morning, the government has responded to these events. Further conflict is in no one's interest. The only beneficiaries would be the terrorists and extremists, seeking to use the chaos as cover to advance their abhorrent objectives. So we are urging all people, all parties, to de-escalate as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the safety and security of British citizens and our interests in the region are of paramount concern. The Foreign Commonwealth Office has strengthened its travel advice to both Iran and Iraq and will keep it under constant review. We urge British nationals in the region or those intending to travel to regularly check government.uk for further updates. And we have taken other urgent measures to protect British nationals and interests. The Department for Transport are reviewing the threat state and advice to Red Ensign shipping on a daily basis, and supported by the Ministry of Defence, we will issue guidance imminently. And at the same time, Defence are changing the readiness of our forces in the region, including helicopters and ships on standby to assist if the need arises. To ensure the safety and security of our personnel, we have also relocated non-essential personnel from Baghdad to Tajik. Coalition forces in Iraq, including British forces, have suspended all training activities, and as part of prudent planning, a small team has been sent to the region to provide additional situational awarenesses and contingency planning assistance. Mr. Speaker, on the 5th of January, Iraq's Council of Representatives voted to end permission for coalition activities in Iraq. As the vote is only one part of the process, we are in discussions of what those implications mean with our Iraqi interlocutors. Today, I would simply remind the House that the coalition is in Iraq at the request of the Iraqi government to help protect Iraqis and others from the very real threat of Daesh. Our commitment to Iraq's stability and sovereignty is unwavering, and we urge the Iraqi government to ensure the coalition is able to continue our vital work countering this shared threat. Mr. Speaker, the main focus of the UK government is to de-escalate this issue. None of us wants conflict. None of us wants our citizens, our friends and our allies to be put at risk. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, from the outset has spoken to President Trump, President Macron, Chancellor Merkel and President Erdogan, and will continue to engage with other world leaders. The Foreign Secretary and I have been talking to our counterparts, and only this morning I met with His Royal Highness, the Saudi Vice Minister for Defence, and in tandem we are working with the E3 to reboot the JCPO, the nuclear deal, which we believe is a vital step to achieving a more stable Iran. And in the coming days, we will be doing all we can to encourage Iran to take a different path. No one should be under an illusion that long before the death of General Soleimani, Iran had stepped up its destabilising activities in the region, whether it was targeting dissidents in Europe or hijacking civilian ships. This aggressive behaviour was never going to go unchallenged. Her Majesty's government, Mr. Speaker, urges Iran to return to the normal behaviour of the country it aspires to be and resist the urge to retaliate.
Yeah. The Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for an advance copy of his statement. Could he tell us where the Prime Minister is and what is he doing that's so much more important than addressing Parliament on the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani? An extremely dangerous and aggressive act that risks starting yet another deadly war in the Middle East. On Friday, I sent the Prime Minister a letter posing a series of questions. He has not answered any of them. Instead, today, he's hiding behind his Defence Secretary. Isn't the truth, Mr. Speaker, that he's scared to stand up to President Trump because he's hitched his wagon to the prospect of a toxic Trump trade deal? Instead, Mr. Speaker, at this highly dangerous moment, we find the government giving cover and even expressing sympathy for what is widely regarded as an illegal act because they're so determined to keep in with President Trump. This assassination puts British troops and civilians, as well as the people of the region, in danger. Mr. Speaker, as the Secretary of State for Defence will confirm, I've long spoken out against the Iranian government's human rights record, including when he and I visited Iran together in 2014. This is not a question of Soleimani's actions or record on the region. Whatever the record of any state official, the principle and the law is that we don't go around assassinating foreign leaders. Without the clear demonstration of an immediate threat, it is illegal. So does the government regard the assassination as legal under international law? If so, how? And do the lawyers in the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence regard it as legal? If he really believes this was an act of self-defence, what evidence has he or the Prime Minister seen of the imminent attack on the US? He says the US is confident attacks were imminent. But US officials have been quoted in the press saying that the evidence is, quotes, razor thin. How would he describe it? In the past few days, the US President has threatened to target Iranian cultural sites. To attack Iran in that manner is, to quote him directly, disproportionate. Both these actions would be war crimes, and yet the government still seems unable to condemn such threats. On Sunday, the Foreign Secretary said the onus was entirely on Iran to de-escalate. I wonder, if Iran had assassinated an American general, whether the British government would be telling Washington that the onus was entirely on the US to de-escalate? Mr. Speaker, we talk about this as a conflict between the US and Iran, but the worst consequences are likely to be felt by Iraq, a country on the brink of further terrible violence and instability. President Trump has threatened Iraq with sanctions like they've never seen before, after its elected parliament, yes, elected parliament, voted to ask the United States and other foreign forces to leave their country. And he has said he will not withdraw entirely unless the US is compensated for the extraordinarily expensive airbase that was actually built by Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. The Prime Minister, when he finally resurfaced from his trip, said he was committed to the sovereignty of Iraq. So will the Secretary of State confirm that the government will respect Iraqi sovereignty if the Iraqi government asks all foreign forces, including British forces, to leave? Mr. Speaker, we know the British government wasn't consulted by the Trump administration in advance, despite there being obvious British interests at stake. I ask also, what is the government doing to secure the release of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe and other dual nationals currently in detention in Iran? This must be an utterly terrifying time, both for them individually and for their families. It's not in anyone's interest for this to escalate to an all-out war. All sides should exercise maximum restraint and allow for meaningful dialogue led by the UN Secretary-General's office. To prevent war, we need a strong plan for diplomacy. So is the government in contact with the UN Secretary-General? And let's not forget, Mr. Speaker, that there was a diplomatic plan, the Iran nuclear deal. It was working until President Trump came along and tried to rip it up. Mr. Speaker, time and time again over the last 2 decades, the political and military establishments have made the wrong call on military interventions in the Middle East. Many of us opposed the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the failed invasion of Afghanistan, and I opposed the bombing of Libya in 2011. Have we learnt nothing from those events? This House must rule out plunging our country into yet another devastating war at the behest of another state.
Secretary of State. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I noticed, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition's actually letter to the Prime Minister in which he posed 3 questions to the Prime Minister, none of which of those questions he just posed from the dispatch box. So I think that was rather interesting. I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, instead of getting a serious interrogation of the situation about how we are going to de-escalate this situation in the Middle East, how we are going to make sure British citizens and British allies are secure, we've had the usual tripe about this is about Trump, this is about America, and all the anti-American, anti-imperialist guff that we've had from it. The Leader of the Opposition asked where the Prime Minister is. Well, fun enough, the Prime Minister is running the country, Mr. Speaker, something the Leader of the Opposition will fail to ever do as a result of the election. And this Prime Minister actually believes in a cabinet government and letting the members of the cabinet who are responsible for their policy come to the House to be able to answer the questions around the policy matter. And indeed, as the Secretary of State Defence, who has a significant number of assets in the region, in Iraq at the moment, and is charged with the duty of defending this country, the Prime Minister felt it was appropriate for me to attend to answer the questions in his place. I think we could perhaps answer some of the questions. What few questions were made by the Leader of the Opposition. First of all, it is for the United States to answer in detail to whether it views the intelligence it made its decision on are whether illegal or not. From the information and intelligence that I have seen, what I could say is that it is clear there was a case for self-defense to be made about an individual who had come to Iraq to coordinate murder and attacks on US citizens. It begs the question, Mr. Speaker, what the Leader of the Opposition would do if that individual had come to Iraq or anywhere else to plot the murder of British soldiers and diplomats. Perhaps, like he recommended with al-Baghdadi of ISIS, he would seek to have him arrested at that particular moment in time. It is, of course, the case that this government is engaged in a full diplomatic effort at all levels to seek to de-escalate the tensions that have grown in the region. Indeed, not only at the United Nations, but in leader-to-leader, defence sec and foreign sec, and all other levers we have, broader than just in the region, to seek efforts to make sure that both Iran does not retaliate in any way that would escalate the situation, and indeed that our friends and allies do not escalate the situation either. The call that this government is making is to make sure that we pause, that we focus on the safety of the peoples of that region and seek a way out, both for Iran and indeed for its neighbours. The first way we can do that, and this government is determined to try and do that, is make sure that the destabilising activity that has been going on in that region is ceased, so we can all progress to find a solution to the conflict that we desperately want. In the meantime, this government will get on and make sure it keeps people safe in the region, and we will do everything we can to protect them and their lives.
So the Defence Secretary there, tattling the accusation from Jeremy Corbyn that Boris Johnson is hiding behind him in not coming to the Commons to address Parliament. Also announcing, Ben Wallace, that the government is taking urgent measures to protect British nationals and interests in the Gulf following the killing of General Qasem Soleimani in that US drone strike. Penny Morden, former Defence Secretary, on her feet now. But let's go to Westminster. Our chief political correspondent is there. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, is hosting a meeting of the National Security Council later on all this, isn't he?
Yeah, and they've had a cabinet meeting today already, and that National Security Committee meeting will go on later today. Now, the criticism that you heard there from Jeremy Corbyn is that Boris Johnson hasn't turned up to make the statement himself, and he said what could be more important than this issue. Now, the response to that from Downing Street and from the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace there was that the Prime Minister believes in cabinet government, that he's perfectly happy to allow the cabinet ministers, who are really the main people looking at the detail of this situation, to come and answer questions from MPs. But I think it can be seen as a different approach, if you like, under this government, under Boris Johnson, that he won't necessarily be the person reacting to everything on the news at all times. I think the tone from Ben Wallace was very interesting there, talking about America's right to self-defence, making the point that there had been dozens of attacks on American assets in Iraq, and that actually General Soleimani was going there to make sure that there were some more. So he said America had shown restraint for a very long time. He didn't go as far as saying that this was an acceptable thing to do. He didn't answer the question about whether government lawyers here think it was legal. Jeremy Corbyn clearly saying there that he thinks it was an illegal act, but that strong message there calling for de-escalation. I think the interesting thing is really what role the UK will have in all of that, what role Boris Johnson himself will have all of that, given that he does have a good relationship with Donald Trump. The fact, of course, though, that the Americans did not tell the British about this in advance, even though British forces are, of course, out in Iraq, was pretty telling. So there's likely to be many more questions from MPs on all of that. And I think the other interesting thing that Ben Wallace talked about there was the government and the Prime Minister trying to reboot, he said, the nuclear deal. That nuclear deal, of course, that America pulled out of.
Yeah, and having just listened to Mike Pompeo in Washington, that would seem quite a challenge at this stage. It was interesting, Jeremy Corbyn making the point repeatedly that at the heart of what he believes is going on is the UK will not rattle Donald Trump's presidency because there's a deal that needs to be done post-Brexit.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a criticism really from Labour and other opposition parties for a very long time. We heard it a lot during the general election that Boris Johnson wouldn't be prepared to stand up to Donald Trump because he's so desperate to get a trade deal after Brexit. So that while that trade deal and those talks will be going on, why on earth would he stand up, criticise even the Prime Minister? So I think this is going to be very interesting, particularly, of course, if Donald Trump is re-elected, how the British government over the next few years deals with a president like Donald Trump, who, as we have seen, is very, very unpredictable. He's prepared to do things that others wouldn't do, doesn't necessarily consult with his allies. All of that is going to be a huge challenge to Boris Johnson in the coming months and possibly years. And how he deals with that, I think, will be very interesting.
Continued debate in the House of Commons. They're also going to be talking about Brexit later, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. The withdrawal agreement bill, that is the divorce settlement, if you like, that will be going through Parliament, has to be got through, of course, by the end of January, which is the Brexit date, the date that the UK leaves the EU. They're hoping to get this through pretty quickly by the end of the week in the House of Commons. And, of course, this shows how things have changed with the government having a majority now of 80. Any amendments that are selected for discussion, there is no chance of the government losing any of those votes. And even really in the House of Lords, when it goes there, I think very unlikely that they're going to cause too much trouble for the government before the end of January.
Vicky Young, Happy New Year.
And you.
Thank you very much. You're watching Afternoon Live from BBC News. The burial of the Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani, who was killed in a US drone strike on Friday, is now underway in his hometown of Kerman. The final stage of his funeral had been postponed after at least 50 people were killed and more than 200 injured in a stampede. General Soleimani was considered the second most powerful man in Iran, and his assassination has raised fears of a conflict between the United States and Iran. Well, in Washington, the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has this afternoon been defending President Trump's decision to assassinate General Soleimani.
Anytime a president makes a decision of this magnitude, there are multiple pieces of information that come before us. We presented that to him in all its broad detail. We gave him all the best information that came not only from the intelligence community, but for those of us who have teams in the field. We evaluated the relevant risks and the opportunity that we thought might present itself at some point. And we could see clearly that not only had Soleimani done all of the things that we have recounted, right? Hundreds of thousands, a massacre in Syria, enormous destruction of countries like Lebanon and Iraq, where they've denied them sovereignty, and the Iranians have really denied people in those two countries what it is they want, right? Sovereignty, independence, and freedom. This is all Soleimani's handiwork. And then we'd watch as he was continuing the terror campaign in the region. We know what happened at the end of last year in December, ultimately leading to the death of an American. So if you're looking for imminence, you needn't look no further than the days that led up to the strike that was taken against Soleimani. And then you, in addition to that, have what we could clearly see were continuing efforts on behalf of this terrorist to build out a network of campaign activities that were going to lead potentially to the death of many more Americans. It's the right decision. We got it right. The Department of Defense did excellent work, and the president had a entirely legal, appropriate, and a basis, as well as a decision that fit perfectly within our strategy and how to counter the threat of malign activity from Iran more broadly.
Mike Pompeo. Here, Parliament resumed today, and the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, made a statement to the Commons on the UK response to the killing. Well, let's talk to our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young, who's at the Houses of Parliament. And, the attack from the Labour Party, from Jeremy Corbyn, was on the lack of appearance by the Prime Minister at the Commons.
Yeah, that's right. But Ben Wallace saying that actually the Prime Minister believes in cabinet government, and Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, is well across what is going on there. The fact that British armed forces are there, and he is able, he says, to answer those questions. And I think what was interesting about Ben Wallace's response here, he didn't really talk about the legality of what the Americans did. He did say that he felt there was a case for self-defence because there had been so many attacks on the Americans in the run-up to what's happened. So he's being incredibly cautious. You can see the difficulty that he has here. There is not a robust defence necessarily of what the Americans have done, but nor is there really huge criticism of it either. This is what Ben Wallace had to say this afternoon.
Since the early hours of Friday morning, the government has responded to these events. Further conflict is in no one's interest. The only beneficiaries would be the terrorists and extremists, seeking to use the chaos as cover to advance their abhorrent objectives. So we are urging all people, all parties, to de-escalate as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the safety and security of British citizens and our interests in the region are of paramount concern. Defence are changing the readiness of our forces in the region, including helicopters and ships on standby to assist if the need arises. To ensure the safety and security of our personnel, we have also relocated non-essential personnel from Baghdad to Tajik. Coalition forces in Iraq, including British forces, have suspended all training activities, and as part of prudent planning, a small team has been sent to the region to provide additional situational awarenesses and contingency planning assistance.
Now, Ben Wallace also said that Iran's behaviour, not just recently but over the months and years, was never going to go unchallenged. Now, there is a broader question about the relationship between this government, between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. How much influence can the British Prime Minister really have over the President? He is unpredictable, and we know that in this case, the British were not told in advance of what was going to go on, even though there are very many British service personnel in Iraq. This is what Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, had to say.
Could he tell us where the Prime Minister is and what is he doing that's so much more important than addressing Parliament on the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani? An extremely dangerous and aggressive act that risks starting yet another deadly war in the Middle East. On Friday, I sent the Prime Minister a letter posing a series of questions. He has not answered any of them. Instead, today, he's hiding behind his Defence Secretary. Isn't the truth, Mr. Speaker, that he's scared to stand up to President Trump because he's hitched his wagon to the prospect of a toxic Trump trade deal? Instead, Mr. Speaker, at this highly dangerous moment, we find the government giving cover and even expressing sympathy for what is widely regarded as an illegal act because they're so determined to keep in with President Trump. This assassination puts British troops and civilians, as well as the people of the region, in danger.
The current Labour leader, and of course the race to succeed him, is hotting up.
Yeah, it is. It's going to be quite a long race. We won't know until April who the new leader is. Before that, we have various candidates throwing their hats into the ring. The sixth and latest, probably the last one, Rebecca Long-Bailey, very much seen as the person who would carry on with the same policies as Jeremy Corbyn. She's being backed by the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. She talked today about protecting socialism in the Labour Party, really continuing in that vein. Now, all the candidates do have to get over a few more thresholds before they make it onto the final ballot paper. They have to get the backing of 10% of Labour MPs, for example. Not all of them might manage that. They also have to get support from various unions and from constituency Labour parties. So we'll see what the final field is. But there are many people who think that Rebecca Long-Bailey, because she has the backing of the left of the party, she has the backing of Momentum, that incredibly successful grassroots organisation which propelled Jeremy Corbyn to the leadership. They really think that she is going to be the person to beat in this race.
Vicky, thank you very much. Vicky Young there in Westminster. I'm going to take you back to the House of Commons. The Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, is still taking questions. We are awaiting the start of the debate over the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, which is at its committee stage and will be debated shortly. But let's hear now from the Defence Secretary, continuing his statement on the security situation in the Middle East.
The United States Defence Secretary made it very clear that the US policy was not to target heritage sites. Mark up.
Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons the US pulled out of the JCPOA was the fact that it wasn't comprehensive in the sense that it didn't cover all of the other terrorist actions that were being taken place, including those carried out by General Soleimani. Does the Secretary of State think that one of the ways of kick-starting and using what has happened as a diplomatic opportunity for peace is to try and widen the JCPOA's remit to cover all of those other actions rather than just being focused on the nuclear arrangements, important though they are?
My right honourable friend talks a lot of sense, and indeed that reflects what both sides used to want. In the early 2006, the Iranians made what was called the Grand Bargain, which was a whole offer, including, if memory serves right, the recognition of Israel, funnily enough, and including the abandonment of any nuclear programme. Both sides seem to want a grand offer. Both sides want to see a grand deal. I think it is our duty to try and get them to the table to offer that grand deal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I press upon the Minister the importance of our UK citizens and residents who are based in prisons in Evin, in the case of my constituent, who remains an employee of the British Council? When was the last time that a ministerial intervention led to the improvement of welfare of any of those prisoners, or led to the hope that they will be returned, in this case, to Crouch End in London?
I can get the honourable friend the exact detail of when. Look, all the time we are visiting or trying to visit with interlocutors those individuals held in those prisons. And as you rightly say, it is not just one individual. There is a whole group of many nations, not just British Iranian nationals, but also European, American, etc., held there. It is part of a deliberate policy, and the individuals in the judiciary in Iran that have been appointed most recently are a worrying sign about what is the intention at the moment of the Iranian regime for the carrying on this policy. We have to change that policy, and in the meantime we have to be absolutely alert to the health and well-being of those people in there, and we will try, not just only with our own embassy staff, but also with other third countries about what help they can give to increase pressure within Iran, but also to make sure we support those prisoners.
Tim Martin. Mr. Speaker, protecting and promoting culture is a key way of stabilising countries and forging bonds between nations, and to that end the government's support of the British Museum scheme, training archaeologists to go back and restore those sites so desecrated by Daesh, is a real win-win situation. And in 2017 the UN Security Council voted, including America, to condemn those acts against UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So would the Secretary of State agree that if the US President has now decided unilaterally to reverse that policy, it's not only remarkably stupid, but it's counterproductive as well?
Look, my honourable friend makes the point about the crime that it would be to attack heritage sites. I have made it quite clear that the US policy is not to target those sites. It's been clarified by the US Defence Secretary, and we will make sure that we are very clear in our opposition to targeting of heritage sites anywhere in the world, not just in the Middle East. They are part of our heritage and our history.
Jim Shannon. Mr. Speaker, can I also thank the Secretary of State for his statement today. Iran is no longer a place of cultural, historical and human rights diversity. Under General Soleimani and the Quds Force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and their involvement with terrorist groups across the world, Iran has the blood of thousands of innocents on their hands. Iran has said that they will continue to pursue nuclear power. Iran has also stated that they will not rest until Israel is destroyed. So what steps is the Secretary of State taking to provide help and support for Israel in light of the threat from Iran against their so-called enemy? And further, will he publicly state again that this great nation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland stands alongside Israel at all times?
We support Israel. We support their right to defend themselves and their right to exist, and we will work alongside them to make sure that their security is protected. We also will work alongside anyone in the Middle East who seeks to establish better stability and security for their people, but also to make sure that we resolve this current growing conflict.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is obviously vital for global security that Iran does not achieve ownership of nuclear weapons. And so can I thank the Secretary of State for his work with France and Germany to reboot the JCPOA. But given that it is now coming up for 2 years since the US pulled out, if this is not achieved, what is the plan B?
Well, I think we're going to be working hard to make sure it is achieved. The United States President has talked about a grand deal. He has talked about a bigger, more sustainable, long-term deal. He's talked about wanting to do a broader deal. We will, of course, assist in that process if they continue on that path, and we will reach out to the Iranians. Now, we have no ill towards the Iranian people, and we shouldn't forget that this government is concerned and saddened by the loss of up to 50 people in the stampede at the funeral that took place. We send our condolences to those mourners and indeed that population. No one should have to go through that. And our hand of friendship is there for the people of Iran. But if all of this teaches us something, Mr. Speaker, it is that the destabilisation, the leadership of Iran has not served their people well. It has led them down a cul-de-sac, and it has led the Middle East to a less stable, not more stable position.
Final question, Owen Thompson.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, any escalation in tensions in the region could have significant consequences for our armed forces, but also the civilian populations there. So it's time for cool heads. The Commander-in-Chief in the States is not known to be a cool head. So what actions can the government take to ensure that late-night Twitter tirades do not further escalate tensions in the region?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Many of us should take tips about Twitter. I think the main thing is that this was in response in the United States to a specific threat that they took an action. He can disagree whether they should have done that or not. After this action that has taken place, it is a duty on all of us, and I know that the White House and the US administration are also on the same page, that that single event does not lead to an escalation, and they are keen also to de-escalate it. The challenge for this government, for the Germans, the French and our allies, is to make sure we convert those wishes of not wanting to escalate into action, and that's what we're going to be doing over the next days and weeks.
Can I just say to those members who didn't get called, we've got a list of the ones that wasn't, and I would expect them to be taken very early in the next statement or next questions. A point of order, Sir Bernard.
I apologise for raising what is a complicated matter, but I hope you have been given forewarning that this might be raised. It concerns the election tomorrow of the Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means and the other Deputy Speakers.
So some procedural matters discussed in the House of Commons. We are awaiting the three-day debate on the withdrawal bill, the European Union withdrawal agreement bill, which is scheduled to get underway. Well, it's running late already, but will get underway shortly. We've been listening to Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, who earlier said that the government was putting in place urgent measures to protect British nationals and interests amid rising tensions in the Gulf. This is what he had to say about government action so far.
Since the early hours of Friday morning, the government has responded to these events. Further conflict is in no one's interest. The only beneficiaries would be the terrorists and extremists, seeking to use the chaos as cover to advance their abhorrent objectives. So we are urging all people, all parties, to de-escalate as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the safety and security of British citizens and our interests in the region are of paramount concern. Defence are changing the readiness of our forces in the region, including helicopters and ships on standby to assist if the need arises. To ensure the safety and security of our personnel, we have also relocated non-essential personnel from Baghdad to Tajik. Coalition forces in Iraq, including British forces, have suspended all training activities, and as part of prudent planning, A small team has been sent to the region to provide additional situational awarenesses and contingency planning assistance.
That was the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace. Jeremy Corbyn then stood up to question him, and he focused attention on the absence of the Prime Minister.
Could he tell us where the Prime Minister is? And what is he doing that's so much more important than addressing Parliament on the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani? An extremely dangerous and aggressive act that risks starting yet another deadly war in the Middle East. On Friday, I sent the Prime Minister a letter posing a series of questions. He has not answered any of them. Instead, today, he's hiding behind his Defence Secretary. Isn't the truth, Mr. Speaker, that he's scared to stand up to President Trump because he's hitched his wagon to the prospect of a toxic Trump trade deal? Instead, Mr. Speaker, at this highly dangerous moment, we find the government giving cover and even expressing sympathy for what is widely regarded as an illegal act because they're so determined to keep in with President Trump. This assassination puts British troops and civilians, as well as the people of the region, in danger.
Jeremy Corbyn. There are still points of order in the House of Commons chamber, but we'll keep an eye on the progress there of that European Union withdrawal agreement bill discussion, scheduled to get underway a little later this afternoon. But now in a